We all know Codemasters. Today we know them for F1, Grid or Dirt Rally, so yeah, all racing games because that genre simply is their specialty, and there is nothing wrong with that. But they go way back to 1986, and while I will not go that far back, I still will go to 1997. Yeah, the year Gran Turismo was released and was a major influence for all the upcoming racing simulations. Well, at least on consoles. And while Polyphony Digital set the bar, not even GT was the first that did it, because actually they were beat by a few months by a different game. Here's the thing. Gran Turismo was released in Japan in December 1997, but in Europe and North America in 1998. Toca Touring Car Championship was released first in Europe in November 1997, so they clearly beat even GT's original release. I mention this because Toca Touring Car Championship, or Toca Championship Racing in North America, actually is a racing simulator, and while commercially successful, it never reached the highs Gran Turismo did. But that doesn't mean the game is bad, in fact, it's quite the contrary. And it also spawned two sequels, then it spawned the Toca Race Driver trilogy on the PS2, and then it turned into Grid. But Grid is a different story, so let's stick with Toca first. Unfortunately though, there is one major flaw in this first game of the series, which might explain the overall lack of success compared to its Gran Turismo rival. But I will get to that. The game is based on the 1997 British Touring Car Championship, and thus Toca has the same cars and the same drivers. Well, almost. Independent drivers aren't present, but still, you get 8 cars, or rather 8 teams, and each team has 2 drivers. And among those drivers is Gabriele Tarquini, who now is 61 years old, but was still racing up until not too long ago. In fact, he even won the FIA World Touring Car Cup in 2018, well in his 50s. Dude is the GOAT. Now you have your Honda Accord, Audi A4, Renault Megane, Nissan Primera and so on. And they look quite cool. I don't know, there is something about these 90s touring cars that is really awesome for me. And each car controls slightly differently. You will have to drive in 9 tracks total. Well, okay, actually 10, but while all tracks are based on the real tracks the racers drove on, the last track is some fantasy thing in a lava world, for some reason. I also have no idea why you can unlock a tank and a Cadillac in a touring car game that takes itself seriously, but, well, whatever. So up until now there is nothing to really complain about. I actually like how each car is in front of their respective garages, but for some reason they look washed out or something, which is kinda weird. And as soon as you've chosen everything, you are ready to race. Either a single race, time trial or championship. But be prepared. The championship mode is only for those that have patience, on top of the controls themselves being challenging. Now, as soon as you start racing, in single race you can choose to do qualifying or not. If you ignore it, then you simply start from last place. The same happens during the championship mode, but here you have to do the qualifying. Well, technically, the qualification period will start, but you can choose to abort it and start the race. In fact, you can also just do 1 lap out of 3, and whatever time you get, it's the place that you will start in. But if you really want to dominate, I suggest that you do your best during qualifying, because if you get the pole position, then you will get 1 point. Yeah, sure, it doesn't sound like much, but in the end of the day, it will add up in the championship points. Once you've decided to start the race, then you won't have a rolling start, so pay attention and always try to start well. Meaning always try to stay in this yellowish part when the lights hit green, because if you don't, then your opponents will leave you in the dust. But then again, if you are good enough, then you can catch up to all of them and win, because for some reason, while during qualifying the challenge is rather high because the top drivers manage to do amazing laps, during the race the difficulty seems to go down and you always do the fastest laps. And those fastest laps are by far slower than the fastest laps during qualifying, which is, I don't know, weird. But hey, that makes things easier during the race, and that 1 point you can get for pole position, yeah, screw it. However, Toca Touring Car Championship isn't as easy as it seems. And because you will see a lot of this, let's address the elephant in the room. The controls can be shit, which is why I spin around a lot, and I guarantee that you will too. But what actually is the problem? Well, first things first, it is beyond fun to race around these tracks with these cars, no joke. They feel heavy and the physics are, for the most part, good, damn good actually. Especially considering that the game actually has damage on top of it. And while I never got to the point of completely destroying the car, even though I've tried to see what happened, you can still lose your bumper, your lights, your windshield, and so can the opponents. Almost everything stays on the track, and it would be advisable to avoid them because they can upset your car and possibly destroy your race. So on that aspect, the game is absolutely glorious. Also considering the weather effects that also affect your driving, but maybe not as much as one could hope. While it rains, it snows, it gets foggy and so on, the effects the weather has on the track are rather minimal. Minimal! Which is why I say that the effects they have on your driving isn't as big, but it's still noticeable. So up until now, it's all fine and dandy, but then you start to spin around and lose control, which is very easy to do. Here's the thing, for the most part you actually have full control over your car, but there's always that line or a specific point where you turn in a bit too much and suddenly the car feels light as hell. This also happens on the easiest turns quite often, and sometimes even if you drive slower than you should, which is stupid. Now, the tracks have a lot of bumps and you will notice all of them while driving. So the fact that Codemasters went that far to add all kinds of bumps and whatever on every track is actually commendable. And if the car loses stability because you didn't take the racing line and thus lost control of your car because of those bumps, then that's a good thing. Take the damn racing line. But the spins also happen even if you took the racing line, and that's the problem. Basically, the cars are predictable and controllable up to that point, but once it goes a bit too far, then you go spin. It's sad, annoying and frustrating that this even happens, because this actually stops you from driving the way you want and stops you from driving at your limit. You always have to race in constant fear because the car could suddenly decide to spin out of nowhere. And while I had quite a few races where I won, I constantly had to hope the car stays on the road, which actually created really intense races where I was sweating like hell. So yeah, in a way it can be very intense to drive around with this constant fear, but Still, this is the major flaw in Toca Touring Car Championship that almost destroys the game for me, and also the reason why I think it could never compete with Gran Turismo. And that is kind of sad, because otherwise the game is great and feels great. Like I've said, I really enjoyed driving around because it feels realistic, when the car didn't decide to dance around. I didn't mind that once you drive outside the track, then your car slows down by quite a lot. You won't even be able to drive with more than 30 km per hour in some parts of the track outside. That was quite realistic. I also like that you get penalized if you drive into other cars full force. But then again, that system seems to be broken, because sometimes you get a warning, but sometimes you don't. If you get 2 warnings and you then get the third one, you lose 4 championship points. Then you get a 4th warning, you lose 6 additional points with a 5th warning, and if you do it again, I dare you, you get disqualified, and that seems to be like how the real championship works. However, if you get disqualified, you can say goodbye to the championship, because your team always demands a certain amount of points from you to succeed and stay in the competition. Needless to say, always try to avoid hitting others and get the points they want, even if it's really hard to do at times. In itself, I like the system of giving you warnings for colliding with others, but because it's unclear how hard the hit has to be for you to get a warning, that makes collisions something like Russian roulette. Sometimes you get a warning, sometimes you don't. I don't know. But point is, just try to avoid other drivers at all costs and don't think you are playing Destruction Derby or Demolition Racer. Or, you know what, just play single race. There you can send all of them to hell and don't have to worry about warnings. I've mentioned that you also need patience to beat the championship. That's because you have to drive 2 times on each single track, and that can be a bit tedious. You can't even save in between race 1 and race 2 on the same event, so you necessarily need patience and persistence. Well, okay, you can't save in the PlayStation version, which is the version you are seeing. I don't know anything about the PC version. On top of that, you can't simply restart the race like you can in single player. So in Championship, it's either you win or you lose. Or load a save file and start from race 1 in whichever event you are in. That is actually something that annoyed me a bit, because I would be fine not having the option to restart, but then the car too often decides to dance around out of nowhere. It gets really annoying to not be able to restart from race 2, for example. Instead, you always have to restart from race 1. I imagine this part can also annoy a few people, but since I like to race around, the following didn't really bother me too much. But in Championship, you won't drive just 3 laps. You need to drive 6 or 7 laps per race if you've chosen the short championship version or mode. If you've chosen the full championship mode, then each race will have around 18 laps. Think of it as Gran Turismo's endurance races over and over and over and over again until the championship ends. You've seen how the game looks graphically, so I don't have much to say about it. Mainly because it looks quite good for 1997. Mind you that I am playing the original game, meaning original disc, on the PlayStation 3. One thing that disappointed me a bit is the first person view. Yeah, you can drive like a real driver from the cockpit, but it lacks a bit of detail, and every car has the same cockpit with the exact same color. At least change the color, guys! But another great thing is that there are 8 teams racing, so 16 cars at once. So yeah, a lot of carnage, and actually also a lot of fun. but outside of the cockpits themselves everything works and looks quite fine. The sound and music are also fairly fine. Well, the background music isn't anything special, but it's fine for what it is. However, in the end you will be more focused on racing and keeping the car on the track anyway. The cars themselves sound quite realistic, and from what I've gathered, they seem to sound like their real counterparts. So overall, Toca Touring Cars Championship is actually almost an excellent game that suffers from sudden spin issues. You will never really know when the car is going to do whatever and screw you over. But outside of that, this was actually a great start for a franchise that technically still continues to this day. Yeah, Grid is a successor of the Toca franchise. While not quite as good as Gran Turismo 2 or even Driver, personally I would put Toca Touring Cars Championship up there with racing games that everybody has to play on a good old PlayStation 1.